We've already discussed the fact that Hebrew words are gender specific as we've studied through the letters and as I've introduced you to the general themes of this language. But we're going to take a slightly more comprehensive look at this subject right now. Hebrew words are gender specific. So the table, the shulchan, is masculine, the lamp, the menorah, is feminine. These are a couple examples. Plural endings, therefore, in Hebrew are either masculine or feminine. A masculine singular word has no special ending. So if you were referring, for instance, to a burning being, that would be a saraf. There's no special ending on saraf. It's just that three-letter verbal root for burning, saraf. If you wanted to refer to plural burning beings, then you would refer to them as seraphim. You can hear the masculine plural ending im on the end of seraphim. Another example would be Elohim. Im in Elohim is a masculine plural ending. Feminine singular words generally end in a. An example would be the Torah, a mitzvah, a menorah, sukkah. I'm sure these are all words that you're familiar with. Feminine plural form is ot. So a plural mitzvah is mitzvot, plural menorah is menorot, plural sukkah is sukkot, plural Torah is Torot. Here's one interesting one, actually. The Hebrew word for army is tzava. It can also refer to an array or a host. Tzava. The plural ending for tzava is ot. So it's tzavaot. It's just interesting that the Hebrew term for army is a female word. The plural term for armies also is a female word. Tzava, tzavaot. Hebrew has a special dual form which is used for pairs of things. If you have a set of two, then you have a special dual form expression. This isn't something that we have in English. It has the ending sound of im. Im. So for instance, here I have my hand, my yad. If I wanted to refer to my two hands, my set of two hands, I would refer to my yadaim. So again, yad, yadaim. You can hear the im on the end. What would be another example? Here's my ayin, my eye. My two eyes are my einaim. Einaim. So it goes from ayin to einaim. What would be another example? Here's my ozen, my ear. My two ears, my set of two ears, is my oznaim. So it goes from ozen to oznaim. And this goes throughout the Hebrew language. There are a few Hebrew words used in the Tanakh that can end in either masculine or feminine forms. They end in both im and ot. I'll list a couple of them for you here as a little heads up. Shana, the Hebrew term for year, which is based on the root to do something twice or to repeat something, is both expressed as shanot and shanim in the Tanakh. So shana is sometimes shanot, it is sometimes shanim. Also the Hebrew word for generation, dor, is sometimes dorot, it's also sometimes dorim. And then finally the Hebrew word for song, shir, is sometimes shirot, it's sometimes also shirim. For example, the title of the book of Song of Songs in Hebrew is Shir HaShirim. You can hear the masculine plural ending there, shirim. There are also some irregular endings. For instance, you know the Hebrew word for father, it's av. However, the plural of father isn't avim, the plural for father is avot, A-V-O-T. So it goes from av, which is definitely a masculine word, father, to avot, definitely also a masculine word, but using the ot ending. Thankfully, there aren't too many exceptions like this in Hebrew. You can read more about this topic in pages 35 and 36 of your Essentials of Biblical Hebrew book, if you've printed that off from our website, holylanguage.com. Some words in Hebrew are only in the plural. Like, for instance, we have the term heaven in English, but in Hebrew it's always in the plural, heavens. Shamayim is the word, shamayim. Another example would be the Hebrew word for water, which is always in the plural, maim. Another interesting example of this is the Hebrew word for face. The Hebrew word for face is always in the plural, panim. The construct of panim is panei. You may be familiar with this in the place name where Yaakov or Jacob saw God, or El. You remember Panei El. So these are some examples of this. If you want to have a look here with me, we will look at some examples of singular and plural words, and then also how they appear in their construct form. We're going to be using the Hebrew word sus, which is a horse. I hope that you like horses. If not, this isn't going to be a very pleasant exercise for you. I think we all love horses, so this is going to be a pleasant exercise. Also, when we come to the construct form, the horse of something, we're going to use the term ha, which is the, sharon. The sharon is the flat ground, the plains. There's an area in Israel that's called the Sharon. It's because that's the flat area of Israel, the plains of Israel. So, for instance, when you hear about the rose of Sharon, you know what that's talking about. It's the rose that grows in the plains of Israel. So the horse of the Sharon, the Sus HaSharon, is the horse of the plains. That's the term that we're going to use here. So here we have the singular and then the plural forms. We have masculine and feminine, and we have absolute, and construct forms. So, masculine, singular, absolute is sus. Similarly, construct is sus. So, a horse is a sus. If you want to say the horse of the, let's say the prairie. I like the Hebrew term prairie better because I'm a prairie boy when it comes to the translating the term Sharon. So if you wanted to say the horse of the prairie, you would say Sus HaSharon. There is no change between the absolute and the construct form. For the feminine, we have Susa for a female horse, a mare, and then we have Susat for the construct. So if you wanted to say the mare of the prairies, you would say Susat HaSharon. Susat HaSharon. On the plural side, we have Susim in the masculine absolute. Susim, horses. If you wanted to say the horses of, in the male form, let's say the stallions of, then you would say Susei. So you'd say Susei HaSharon, the horses of the prairie. Feminine, absolute, plural, susot. Susot are mares. And also here we have susot. There's no difference between the feminine, plural, absolute, and construct forms. Susot, horses. Susot HaSharon, horses of the prairie. Then we also have our dual form here, which is relatively rare, but it's something that you'll want to be aware of. Masculine dual form in the absolute is Susaim. So a pair of horses or a pair of stallions is Susaim. If you wanted to say the two horses of the prairie, the Sharon, then you would say Susei. So really there's no difference between that Susei in the dual and Susei in the general plural. Then in the feminine, we say Susataim. Susataim. That's the feminine plural. If you wanted to say the mares of in the construct form, the two mares or the pair of mares of the Sharon, you'd say Suste. So Suste HaSharon. Suste HaSharon. So as you study through the Tanakh, just watch for these plural endings: im, masculine; ot, feminine; and aim, dual. Also watch for their construct forms, and you will continue to grow. If you'll turn in your student manual to page 6, we will have a look at Hebrew pronouns. Pronouns, as you know, are words like she, I, them, us, etc. You can also have a look at this material in pages 37 to 43 of Essentials of Biblical Hebrew if you've printed it off from the website. You'll also want to note the list of irregular nouns in Essentials on page 42. For now, though, we'll just be working from page 6 of the student manual. There, you will see this list of separate forms of pronouns. Let's start with the top left. If you want to say I or me in Hebrew, you say ani. Ani. This is one of the first words that Hebrew-speaking children learn to say when they are still small infants. Just like in English, one of the first words that we learn to say is me, ani, ani. A very important word, of course. The other form of it, slightly more fancy, is anochi. Anochi more has the connotation of I myself. I myself. For instance, in the opening lines of the Decalogue, the 10 words spoken audibly by the Creator from Mount Sinai, with several million people present as witnesses, he begins those words with Anochi, where he says, I am your God who brought you out of Egypt. Anochi is the term used there. But generally you would just use Ani. Then we have you addressing a male, Ata. If you're in a group setting, just turn to a male in your group and say Ata, you. Addressing a female, you is At. If you're in a group setting, turn to a female in your group and say At, you. He in Hebrew is Hu. So if you're talking about him, you'll be saying Hu. She in Hebrew is he. So if you're talking about her in Hebrew, you'll be saying he. We can have a little fun with this actually. She is he, and he is who. You can just imagine the confusion that could result from these terms, something along the lines of the who's on first dialogue perhaps. So if you're talking about her, you use the term he. If you're talking about him, you use the term who. Let's look at the plural now. The common term for us or we is anachnu. So anachnu is us or we. The short form that is sometimes used in the Tanakh is nachnu or also anu. However, that isn't very frequently used. Anachnu is the main term. You, addressing a group of males or a mixed group, is atem. Atem. You, addressing a group that is specifically composed of females, is Atena. Atena. You'll sometimes also see the shortened form of that, Aten. They, referring to a group of males, is Hem, or sometimes Hema. They, referring to a group of females, is Hena, or sometimes Hain. So let's just go through these again together. Ani, Anochi, Ata, At, Hu, and he. Nachnu or Anachnu, Atem, Atena, hem, hema, hena, hen. Let's look now at our next list, pronominal suffixes with a preposition. The preposition used here is that one letter prefix, lamed, la, that means to or for. And it often has the connotation of ownership also. So if you were to say, for instance, li, you would be saying to me or for me, but that is also how you would say mine or my sometimes. So let's look through these. To me, li. To you, addressing a male, lecha. To you, addressing a female, lech or lach. To him, lo. To her, la. Then looking at the plural, lanu, to us, lachem, to you, males, lachen, to you, females, lahem, to them, males, lahen, to them, females. So again, li, lecha, lech or lach, lo, la. Plural, lanu, lachem, lachen, lahem, lahen. These pronominal suffixes with a preposition are also applied to a couple of those other one-letter prefixes that are attached to words as prepositions. For instance, you'll remember the second letter in the alphabet, ba, means in. So you could also apply these forms to the letter bet. For instance, be means in me. Becha, in you. Bach, in you, addressing a female. Bo, in him. Ba, in her. Banu, in us. Bachem, in you, plural, addressing a male group. Bachen, in you, plural, addressing a female group. Bahem, in them, male. Bahen, in them, female. This is somewhat similar also for the one-letter prefix mem, or mi, which means from, and also the one-letter prefix kaf as a letter, ka, which means like or according to. Although when it comes to kaf, it actually takes the form of kamo. Therefore, if you wanted to say like me, you would say kamoni, kamoni. If you wanted to say like you, male, you'd say kamocha. You may be familiar with that expression from me, kamocha. The question who is like you. That's used in the Shirat Hayam, the Song at the Sea, in Exodus 15. Mi kamocha, who is like you? Kamech, like you, addressing a female. Kamo, like him, etc. So these are some examples of how these pronominal suffixes sound with a preposition. Let's look now at that third list of other pronouns. Looking at the singular first, if you want to say this, referring to a male object, you say ze. Ze is this, referring to a male object. Zot refers to a female object. Zot. So ze is this male, zot is this female. If you want to say in the plural these, you say ele, ele, plural these. That, Male is hu, female is he. So it's the same as personal pronouns. That is the same as him. For instance, if you're referring to him, you'll say who. So that is the same here. And likewise with the female. Then also, of course, likewise with the plural. Those is hema or haim in the masculine, heina or hain in the feminine. You can turn now to page 7 in your student manual, and we will look at masculine possessive forms and then feminine possessive forms. Possessive forms. So here we have sus, which of course is a male horse or a stallion. And then we have in the next page susa, which is a female horse, a mare. So let's have a look at these first. Singular, sus, horse. Sus construct, as in horse of, again is sus. Then we have my horse, susi. Your horse, addressing a male, suscha. Your horse, addressing a female, suseich. His horse, suso. Her horse, susa. Our horse, susenu. Your horse, addressing masculine plural, suschem. Your horse, addressing feminine plural, suschen. Their horse, male, susam. Their horse, female, susan. Then looking at the plural, susim, horses, susei, horses of, in the construct. My horses, susai, susai. Your horse is addressing a male, susecha. Your horse is addressing a female, susaich. What's the difference here between your horses and your horse addressing a male? Your horse says is susecha, your horse is suscha. The difference is the yod in susecha in terms of how it's spelled. Yod here is simply short for im, which is spelled yod mem. So watch for that yod, that indicates the plural. Again, your horses addressing a male, susecha, your horses addressing a female, susaich. His horses, susav. Her horses, suseha. Remember that form. It's slightly more unique. It's sometimes difficult to read also if you're just learning Hebrew. Suseha. Our horses, susenu. What's the difference between our horse and our horses? Our horses is susenu, our horses susenu. The only difference is the yod in our horses. Your horses, masculine plural. Suseichem. Your horses, feminine plural. Suseichen. Their horses, masculine plural. Suseihem. Their horses, feminine plural. Suseihen. So those are the forms that this term takes when it is a male word. Now let's look at the twin list for the female term susa. Susa, mare. Susat, mare of, in the construct. Susati, my mare. Your mare, addressing a male, susatcha. Your mare, addressing a female, susatech. His mare, Susato. Her mare. Susata. Our mare. Susatenu. Your mare, addressing a male plural group. Susatchem. Your mare, female plural. Susatchen. Their mare. Susatam. Their mare, referring to a feminine group. Susatan. And then we have the plural. Susot, mares. Susot, mares of. Construct form is the same. Susotai, my mares. Your mares is Susotecha, addressing a male. Your mares, addressing a female. Susotaich. His mares, Susotav. Her mares, Susoteha. Our mares, Susotenu. Your mares, addressing a male group. Susotechem. Your mares, addressing a female group. Susotechen. Their mares, referring to a male group. Susotehem. Their mares, referring to a female group. Susotehen. So these are your Hebrew pronouns. I hope that this hasn't been too formidable a coverage of them. At first glance, it seems like so many forms to remember. Just remember this key. Hebrew is largely dependent on context. So as you're reading through a passage, you will often be able to understand the meaning of a word simply by its context. And if you simply can't figure out, then you can refer to this chart, or you can compare with your English translation, etc. So stay encouraged as we continue to learn this language. The pronouns are actually very easy. Let's talk about the definite article for a second. In English, the definite article is the. The is the definite article. In Hebrew, it's ha. You already learned this when we studied the letter hey. Hebrew doesn't have an indefinite article. For instance, in English, an indefinite article is ah. There's no ah in Hebrew. If you're referring to an indefinite object, in Hebrew it's indicated by the absence of the definite article. So for instance, ish is a man. In English we say a man. In Hebrew we just say ish, and it means a man. The definite article, ha, is always a prefix and attached to the front of a word. It's generally pronounced ha, but in a couple instances it's pronounced he. If the word has a vowel on the beginning of it in that first syllable, that would be termed a chet kametz. For instance, a chag would be a word like this. A chag is a festival. Then it would be pronounced he. The definite article would be pronounced he. So instead of saying ha chag, you actually say he chag. It's the same way with unaccented hey and ein kametz. In all of those instances, you say he instead of ha. One more thing about the definite article that you'll want to know. Beginning a sentence with the definite article can turn that sentence into an interrogative sentence. For example, if we eavesdrop, we'll hear a personal conversation between Jacob and Rachel in Genesis 30 verse 2, in which she's telling him that if he doesn't give her children, she's going to die. He responds by asking her if he's in the place of God. Let's read the Hebrew of his question together. This is an example of an interrogative sentence in Hebrew, a sentence that begins with the definite article ha. Ha tachat Elohim Anochi. Hatachat Elohim Anochi. So can you see the ha, the definite article at the beginning of the sentence? In this instance, it makes the whole sentence interrogative, a question. You can read more about the definite article on page 15 of your Essentials of Biblical Hebrew supplementary material. Let's talk about prepositions for a minute. As you know, a preposition is a word that communicates the spatial relationship between one thing and another thing, or between one person and another person. For instance, something is on something else, or a person is next to someone else. This concept of a spatial relationship is what a preposition communicates. We're not going to go into too much detail with prepositions in this particular discussion. We're just going to touch on a couple basic ones. If you want to look it up in greater detail, you can look at page 17 of your supplementary material, Essentials of Biblical Hebrew. We've already covered several of these actually as we were studying through the letters, but I want to tie them all up for you and give you a couple more examples of them. Our first preposition is the one-letter prefix spelled with the letter bet and pronounced ba. Ba on the front of a word means in. It's a preposition. In fact, the very first word in the Torah is a preposition. Let's read that together. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, we read ba reshit, in the beginning. As you're reading through a Hebrew text, you always want to have your eyes peeled for these one-letter prefixes on words because they can throw you. You can assume that it's part of the word, but it's actually a one-letter prefix on the front of a word. So for instance, if you're trying to look up the three-letter root in Bereshit, you might be thrown by that one-letter prefix. You'll think the three-letter root is bet, resh, aleph, or something like that. But that is not the case. So identifying those one-letter prefixes is very important, as you can see from this example. Another example of this letter, bet, as a prefix is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 6. There we read, Yehi rakia betoch ha-mayim. Yehi rakia betoch ha-mayim. Yehi, let there be, rakia, a space or firmament, be, in, toch, midst of, ha, the, mayim, waters. So there you hear betoch, in the midst of. Another one-letter prefix, a very short preposition that is attached to the front of other words, is spelled with letter kaf. It means like or according to. Ka means like or according to. An example of this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. There we read Elohim saying, Na aseh Adam betzalmenu kedemutenu. Na'aseh Adam betzalmenu kedemutenu. Na'aseh, let us make Adam, you know that, Adam, man, humanity, be, in, tzalmenu, our tzelem, our image, ke, like or according to, demutenu, our demut, our likeness. So there you can see kaf as a one-letter prefix meaning like or according to. Another one of these one-letter prefixes is the letter lamed, meaning to or for. We have an example of this one in Genesis chapter 1, verse 10. There we read, U la mikveh ha mayim kara yamim. Let's break that down together. U and la, two. Mikveh, gathering of. Ha, the, mime, waters. Kara, he called or cried out. Yamim, seas or oceans. So there you can see we have an example of a contraction of several one-letter words attached as prefixes to the main word. U and la, two. Mikveh, gatherings of. Another example of lamed is a prefix, a one-letter preposition that is attached to the front of other words, is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. There we read, Le Havdil. Le Havdil. This term in English is translated as to separate. Vadal is that root for separate. So, le havdil, to separate. And finally, we also have the letter mem, making the sound, of course, m, as a one-letter prefix that is attached to the front of words. Now, this one is actually short for a full word that is used as a preposition, and that is min. I would transliterate that M-I-N, min. It means from. You may be familiar with the term min in the famous blessing for bread. If you're sitting down and there's bread on the table, then you sing the Hamotzi. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. In Hebrew, that last section is Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. You can hear the min in there. Hamotzi lechem, who brings forth lechem, bread, min, from haaretz, the earth. So this is an example of min as a full word. However, when min comes before a word with a hard consonant on its front, a non-guttural, then it is simply shortened to mi. Let's have a look at an example of this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. There we read, Shavat Mekol Malachto. Shavat Mekol Malachto. Shavat, he ceased or rested. Me, from. Kol, all. Malachto, his malacha, his work. So there you can see that me is from. Shavat Mikol. He ceased from all. And as you can see, there is that hard consonantal sound on the beginning of kol or all, so you know that it'll be shortened to me. Prepositions preceding a direct article absorb the letter and vowel sound. I'll give you an example. You don't say ba ha bite. Let's say you want to say in the house. You know, a house is a bite. If you want to say the house, then you say habite. But if you want to say in the house, you don't say ba ha bite. You contract it and you say ba bite. So instead of saying ba ha bite, you say ba bite, ba bite. What would be another example? The Hebrew term for name is Shem. So if you want to say the name, you say Ha-Shem. If you wanted to say in the name, you would say Ba-Shem. You wouldn't say Ba-Ha-Shem, you would say Ba-Shem. If you've heard someone pray using Hebrew terminology, you may have heard them finish their prayers by saying Bashem Yeshua HaMashiach. Bashem, in the name of Yeshua the Messiah. This would be an example of this usage of Ba-Shem. So if you wanted to say that you're at home, that you're in the house, you simply say Babait. If you wanted to say I'm at home, you'd say Ani Babait. I'm in the house. I'm at home. Here's an example of this term from the book of Genesis, as used here. Va yikra Elohim la'ol yom. Vayikra, and called Elohim, God, la, to ol, the light, yom, day. Did you notice here that when it says la or, it doesn't say la ha or, to the light, it simply says la or. So this is an example of this usage in the opening lines of the Torah. There are many other prepositions in Hebrew. As you study through the Tanakh, just keep your eyes peeled for them. You will learn them as you go. As we learned when we studied the letter Vav, Vav is a one-letter prefix that, attached to the front of a word, means and. Vav as a conjunctive is usually pronounced V, but there are two situations in which the Vav conjunctive is pronounced U. The first situation is if the Vav is attached to a word that begins with the letter Vet, Mem, or Fe. Vet, Mem, or Fe. Then it's pronounced U. You probably remember our acronym that we created to help us remember those three letters. BUMP. Of course, the soft form of bet and pay is V and F respectively. So we have V, M, F, those three sounds. Then it's pronounced U. We encounter many examples of this in Genesis 1. The first is in Genesis chapter 1 verse 4, where we read that Elohim separated, quote, between the light and the darkness. Let's have a look at that passage. Bein ha or uvein ha choshech. Bein ha or, between the light, u, and vein ha choshech, between the darkness. So as you can see here, when Vav precedes the letter Bet, actually the letter Vet in this case, it has the U sound. The second situation that Vav, as the conjunctive on the front of a word, is pronounced as U, is when the Vav is attached to a word in which the first letter has a shva. For instance, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, we encounter the couplet for male and female. Zachar u nekeva. Can you see how nekeva has a one-letter syllable on the front, nun, with the shava under it? That means the vav before it will actually be pronounced as u. Zachar u nekeva. We see another example of this in the next verse, where Elohim blesses the first humans to be fruitful and multiply. He says to them, Peru ur vu. Peru ur vu. Again, that revu there has a shva under the first letter, under the resh, so the vav is pronounced as an u. Many Hebrew sentences, as we discussed when I was first introducing the language to you, begin with the conjunctive with and. We see this in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3, for instance, where the sentence begins, Vayomer Elohim, and God said, let there be light. You can read more about the conjunctive on page 19 of your supplementary material, Essentials to Biblical Hebrew. Adjectives are describing words. In English, the adjective comes before the noun that it describes. So for instance, you have a man, an ish in Hebrew. If you want to describe him as being happy, then in English you say a happy man. the adjective, the describing word, comes before the noun. In Hebrew, however, it's the reverse. Nouns are followed by the adjectives that describe them. Hebrew grammar follows the noun-adjective pattern. Therefore, in Hebrew, you don't say the Hebrew word for happy, sameach, and then ish. You don't say sameach ish, happy man. In Hebrew, you say ish sameach, ish man, sameach, happy. So, as you can hear, the sameach, the happy describing word, follows ish, man. Adjectives in Hebrew agree with the nouns that they describe in 3 areas: gender, number, and definite article. I'll give you some examples of how adjectives agree with nouns in the 3 areas of gender, number, and definite article. Let's look at the phrase eitz tov. Now, an eitz is a tree. Tov is an adjective. It's a describing word. You know that one. Good. Tov is good. So, eitz tov is a good tree. If we wanted to say good trees, how would we say that? Eitz is a masculine word. So, tov is also a masculine word. And if we add that masculine ending plural on there, eitzim, then we also add it to tov. Therefore, if we wanted to say good trees, we would say eitzim tovim. You can see how we added plural to both the noun and the adjective following it. Eitzim tovim. What if you wanted to say the good tree? What if you wanted to refer to a tree with the definite article? You would say ha'etz, the tree, and then you would say ha'tov. Ha'etz, ha'tov, the good tree. You can see how the adjective ha'tov agrees with the noun in the definite article. They both have ha on the front. How about if you wanted to say the good trees? How would you say that? Once again, these 2 words must agree with each other in gender, in the definite article on the front, and in the number. So we would say ha eitzim ha tovim. Ha eitzim ha tovim. The good trees. What if we wanted to say the tree is good? How would we say the tree is good? In that case, because you're not saying the good tree, you're saying the tree is good, you would say ha'etz tov. Ha'etz tov. The plural, if you wanted to say the trees are good, you would say ha'etzim tovim. Ha'etzim tovim. You could actually reverse this too. In Hebrew, you could also say tov ha'etz. Good is the tree. Tov ha'etz. Or if you wanted to say that the trees are good, you could say tovim ha'etzim. Tovim ha'etzim. For more information on adjectives and how they function, how you can best apply them, check out page 19 of your supplementary material in Essentials. You can also check out the exercises in Golden's First Year in Hebrew. It's a heritage document that you can download from our website, holylanguage.com, off of the Heritage Library page. You'll want to check out pages 5 to 10, the exercises in pages 5 to 10 of H.E. Golden's First Year in Hebrew. So I'll let you go ahead and check out those resources, and also just keep your eyes open as you're studying through the text for adjectives and how they work. We touched on syntax, that is to say, the word order in a sentence, in our introduction to the Hebrew language, but let's take a slightly more closer look at syntax. In Hebrew, the verb usually begins the sentence. There are two exceptions to this rule. Firstly, when an interrogative pronoun, such as what or who, occurs in a sentence, then the interrogative pronoun comes before the verb. Secondly, when the negative, that is to say words like ain or lo, occur, then they will often precede the verb also. When particular emphasis is desired, almost any word may come first in a sentence actually, but the general rule is that the verb comes first. The prominence of verbs in the Hebrew sentence structure makes Hebrew a dynamic and action-oriented language. A practical exercise when reading a translation of the Hebrew Bible that will help you get in this Hebraic action-oriented mindset is to emphasize the verbs as you read. Emphasizing the verbs is a very simple reading technique that will help you feel the dynamic tone of the original Hebrew texts of Scripture. It will cause the action in the Scriptures to jump off the page in vivid life. I encourage you to try it sometime. I encourage you to get in the habit of reading that way. A typical English sentence will run subject, verb, direct object. What would be a sample sentence like this? Izzy ate the pickled herring. Izzy is the subject. Ate is the verb, and the pickled herring is the direct object of the verb. This would be a typical English sentence. A typical Hebrew sentence, however, would run verb, subject, direct object. So, in Hebrew, you would say, ate Izzy the pickled herring. We actually see this sentence structure in Genesis 1 verse 1. It says, Bara Elohim et hashamayim. Bara created Elohim et hashamayim, the heavens. So right there, you can hear it. I encourage you as you continue to read through the Tanakh and study Hebrew texts to take note of Hebrew syntax. Take note especially of areas in which it's different than English. You'll grow tremendously in your understanding as you simply keep your eyes open in this area as you continue to read the Tanakh. In the mid-1800s, Hebrew wasn't an everyday language. It was the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. The use of Hebrew was generally restricted to the synagogue and house of study, to the fields of prayer and Torah study. Today, however, Hebrew is spoken as an everyday language. It's the mother tongue of over 6 million Jews. It's the official language of the State of Israel. What happened to the Hebrew language to cause it to go from being the liturgical language of Judaism to being a modern national language spoken by the population of Israel, just like it was in the First and Second Temple eras? What happened to the Hebrew language to cause this meteoric change? Well, in a word, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda happened to the Hebrew language. In this discussion, which is the 7th of our 7 discussions on the history of Hebrew, I'm going to tell you the story of this remarkable man. Eliezer ben Yehuda's story is also the story of how God miraculously brought the Jewish people back to the land of Israel, in accordance with his ancient promise. Eliezer ben Yehuda was born Eliezer Yitzchak Perelman in the Lithuanian village of Lusky on January 7, 1858. Like the majority of Jewish children in Eastern Europe, little Eliezer began learning Hebrew at the age of 3, as part of an intensive Torah upbringing. Eliezer's father, Yehuda Leib Perelman, was a devout Jew who belonged to the Chabad sect of Judaism. Sadly, Yehuda Leib contracted tuberculosis. One day as he and his 5-year-old son Eliezer were studying the holy texts together, he fell into a great coughing fit, collapsed, and died right before his stricken son. Leib's last words to his little son were to clean the Torah of the blood that he had coughed onto it, and make it readable once more. Young Eliezer was sent to live with his mother's uncle, David Wolfson, who had the financial means to support the young boy. Eliezer was a brilliant student and excelled in his religious studies. By the age of 13, he had already studied through much of the Talmud and other Jewish sources. After Eliezer's bar mitzvah, he was sent to a yeshiva in Polotsk, with the hopes that he would one day become a great rabbi. As it turned out, the head of the yeshiva, Joseph Blocher, was relatively liberal compared to the strict Orthodox norms of his time, and introduced the impressionable young Eliezer to many non-Orthodox ideas, such as the usage of Hebrew in texts that were not religious texts. On one occasion, Rabbi Blocher introduced Eliezer to a thin book of Hebrew grammar. On another occasion, when the two of them were alone, Rabbi Blocher pulled out a secret copy of Robinson Crusoe that had been translated into Hebrew and had Eliezer read a short section. Eliezer later said, "Since that first glance at a Hebrew Robinson Crusoe, I fell in love with Hebrew as a living language." It didn't take long before word of these unorthodox activities reached Eliezer's uncle David, who was so upset that he called Eliezer home and, after several vain attempts to terrify him into amending his ways, kicked him out of the house with an order to never come back. Providentially, Eliezer ended up in a town called Glubokia, where he met a well-educated and well-to-do man named Solomon Naphtali Hertz Jonas, and was virtually adopted into his family. Jonas's eldest daughter, Devorah, tutored Eliezer in several languages, including Russian and French. Eliezer also read extensively from the classical European authors that lined the bookshelves of the Jonas home. After 2 blissful years, Eliezer's Russian studies enabled him to enter a Russian high school. He left the Jonas home with great reluctance, and only after promising Devorah that he would write to her and asking her to wait until he returned for her. Eliezer graduated from the Russian high school in 1877 at the age of 19. 1877 turned out to be a pivotal year for the youthful Eliezer in more ways than one. Russia had just declared war on the Ottoman Empire, with the objective of helping the Bulgarians regain their independence from the Turks. Eliezer was captivated by the concept of national restoration, so vividly pictured by the restoration of the Bulgarian people to the status of a sovereign nation on their ancestral homeland. Eliezer felt deeply that if the Bulgarians, who were not an ancient classical people, could demand and obtain a state of their own, then the Jews, the people of the book, and the heirs of historic Jerusalem definitely deserve the same. Eliezer later wrote about that time, and one watershed night in particular. It was the middle of the night. After a number of hours of reading the papers and reflecting on the fate of the Bulgarians and their future freedom, suddenly, as if lightning struck, an incandescent light radiated before my eyes. My conscious thought flew from Shifka Pass in the Balkans to the Jordan River crossing in the land of Israel, and I heard a strange inner voice calling to me, the revival of Israel and its language on the land of the forefathers. This was the dream, and indeed, it seemed to me at the first instant that it was nothing more than a dream, a vision of the night. However, I soon realized that it is not a dream, or at least not one that would soon leave me. In response to this overwhelming experience, Eliezer dedicated his life to seeing the nation of Israel and its language revived in the land of Israel. Perhaps his life's mission could be best summed up by this voice that he heard in this seemingly supernatural experience, the revival of Israel and its language on the land of the forefathers. Eliezer began making plans immediately. He felt strongly that he himself must go to Israel. He left Russia in 1878, first going to Paris to study medicine so as to be a future help to the Jewish community in Israel. While in Paris, Eliezer published several articles in various Hebrew periodicals on the renaissance of the Jewish people, their land and their language. His first essay, The Burning Question, was published in 1879 by the Hebrew periodical Hashachar, the Dawn, but only after it was rejected by several other papers. In Paris, Eliezer adopted the pen name Eliezer ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda had a double meaning as son of Yehuda, which was his father's Hebrew name, and son of Judea, referring to the Judean land of Israel. After Eliezer permanently transferred his residency to Israel, his pen name, Eliezer ben Yehuda, became his actual name. As a side note, it's sometimes said that when Ben Yehuda began calling for this Hebrew renaissance through his early articles, Hebrew was only a written language. For instance, we read in William Henry Green's Hebrew Grammar, published in 1861, that, quote, "The Hebrew, being no longer a spoken tongue, is only known as the language of books, and particularly of the Old Testament, which is the most interesting and important, as well as the only pure monument of it." This isn't actually true, though. In Eliezer's time, Hebrew was spoken by Jews, just not in everyday contexts. It's also often suggested that in Ben Yehuda's time, Hebrew was a dead language. The term dead as applied to Hebrew is another incorrect and much abused term. For instance, noted philologist Chaim Rabin says that, quote, "It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that at the time of Ben Yehuda's first article in 1879, over 50% of all male Jews were able to understand the Pentateuch, the daily prayers, etc., and some 20% could read a Hebrew book of average difficulty, allowing for a much higher proportion in Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Yemen, and a very much lower one in Western countries." So as you can see, it's more correct to say that before Ben Yehuda's time, Hebrew simply wasn't in use as an everyday language, and it certainly wasn't the common language of the Jewish people in Israel at that time. So back to our story. During Ben Yehuda's 4 years in Paris, he contracted tuberculosis and was forced to discontinue his studies. Despite Eliezer's potentially fatal disease, Devorah Jonas, who had kept her promise to wait for him for those many years, insisted on their marriage. They rendezvoused en route to Israel and were married in Egypt in 1881. The newly married Ben Yehudas arrived in the country that most of the world then called Palestine, with Eliezer burning with his vision to see the Hebrew people and language revived. The young couple settled in Jerusalem, planning to use the ancient capital of Israel as their base for spreading Eliezer's revivalist ideas throughout Israel and the diaspora. Eliezer ben Yehuda was a man of extreme measures. For instance, before Ben Yehuda landed on the shores of Israel, he resolved to only speak Hebrew when communicating with other Jews. Ben Yehuda felt that his speaking in any language other than Hebrew would compromise his message of the restoration of the Hebrew language. He had proven to himself from multiple conversations with friends and acquaintances that this was possible, albeit challenging due to the shortage of Hebrew words on certain key topics. Eliezer was greatly encouraged by his first conversations in Hebrew when he and Devorah disembarked from the boat in Israel's port city of Jaffa. He successfully talked with a Jewish money changer, a Jewish innkeeper, and a Jewish wagoner, all in Hebrew. Here, finally, he had encountered simple people who could speak Hebrew, perhaps with mistakes, but still more or less naturally and freely. Another extreme measure Ben Yehuda took was the one stipulation he set before he and Devorah were wed. The only language that Devorah would be allowed to speak to their forthcoming children would be Hebrew. Therefore, when their first son, Ben Zion, was born in 1882, Eliezer made Devorah promise that their son should hear no foreign languages, only Hebrew. Ben Yehuda felt that this was a very important symbolic event for the future of the revival. With a child in the house who would be raised speaking only Hebrew, parents and visitors would be forced to speak only Hebrew. And even more importantly, when the child would finally begin to speak on his own, Ben Yehuda would have living proof that a complete revival of the language was, indeed, possible. Ben Zion, who later adopted the pen name Itamar ben Avi, described in his autobiography some of the drastic precautions taken by his father to ensure that he would hear only Hebrew, Thus, for example, when visitors came to the house who did not know Hebrew, his father would send him to bed so that he wouldn't hear their foreign languages. Ben Yehuda's plan was met with much criticism, and, much to his parents' dismay, Ben Yehuda, son Ben Sion, for the first 4 years of his life, never spoke a word. It appeared that Ben Yehuda's experiment was a total flop. Finally, after 4 long years, Devorah broke. One day, when Eliezer was out of the house, she began absent-mindedly singing lullabies to her child in her native Russian. Eliezer returned early, and when he heard Russian being used inside his house, he furiously stormed in and began shouting. Itamar wrote about the bitter scene that followed. "It caused a great shock to pass over me when I saw my father in his anger and my mother in her grief and tears, and the muteness was removed from my lips and speech came to my mouth. Ben Sion burst out crying, 'Abba, Abba, lo, lo,' or, in English, 'Daddy, Daddy, no, no.' When Eliezer and Devorah realized that their son had just spoken his first Hebrew words, they were overwhelmed with joy and began laughing and hugging each other and their son, the first Hebrew-speaking child in almost 2 millennia. With a child in the house who only spoke Hebrew, the need was accentuated to find Hebrew words for objects that weren't mentioned in the Bible and Jewish religious writings. Thus, new Hebrew words were coined by Ben Yehuda for objects such as doll, ice cream, jelly, omelette, handkerchief, towel, bicycle, and hundreds more. In time, even Ben Sion began coining creative Hebrew terms for the objects around him, often combining 2 known words to form compound words describing his subject. And so, as the child grew, so did Hebrew, both in vocabulary and in fluency of expression. It didn't take long before Eliezer and his Hebrew-speaking family had become a living legend, an embodiment of the revival that others soon began to imitate. In Ben Yehuda's first articles, written in his Paris years, Eliezer pointed out how the Russian language had become rooted among the youth in Russia, even among those for whom it was not their mother tongue, by being introduced as the language of instruction in schools. On the same principle, Ben Yehuda preached that rabbis and teachers should use Hebrew as the language of instruction in the Jewish schools in Israel, and for all subjects, both religious and secular. He believed that the revival could only succeed if the younger generation learned to speak Hebrew. Therefore, when Nassim Bechar, the principal of one of the Alliance schools in Jerusalem, proposed to Ben Yehuda a year after he settled in Jerusalem that he teach in his school, Ben Yehuda seized the opportunity. At that time, children from several different Jewish communities would be studying in the same classroom, and they had no other common language which could be used. It was a perfect opportunity to introduce Hebrew as the main modicum of communication. Bechar introduced Ben Yehuda to his method of teaching Hebrew through Hebrew, a direct system with no translation into other languages. Today this system would be called Hebrew immersion. It worked marvelously. Unfortunately, due to health concerns, Ben Yehuda was able to teach for only a brief period at the Alliance School. But his Hebrew teaching there was successful. After just a few months, the children were chattering fluently in Hebrew on daily topics and everyday life. Even more importantly, Ben Yehuda's teaching success made a great impression on other teachers. Teaching in Hebrew at that time posed many challenges. There were almost no trained teachers. There was a shortage of textbooks. Materials, including games and songs, hadn't been created, and the vocabulary Hebrew offered was limited. David Udelevitz, one of Eliezer's early Hebrew teaching colleagues, later wrote, "In a heavy atmosphere, without books, expressions, words, verbs, and hundreds of nouns, we had to begin teaching. It is impossible to describe or imagine under what pressure the first seeds were planted. Hebrew teaching materials for elementary education were limited. We were half mute, stuttering. We spoke with our hands and eyes." Another Hebrew teaching colleague of Eliezer's, David Yellen, wrote along the same vein. Every teacher had a French or Russian teaching book of his own, and he organized his Hebrew work according to it. Terms for teaching did not exist. With respect to creating words according to his taste, everyone used his own creations. In the face of these challenges, Eliezer's success proved that it could be done and was a great encouragement to many new Hebrew teachers. Shortly after their arrival in Jerusalem, Eliezer was able to secure a job writing for a local Hebrew newspaper, Hechavatzelet, or The Lily. 3 years later, in 1884, Eliezer began to publish his own newspaper, Hatzvi. Hatzvi had a double meaning as the dear and as the beautiful, a reference used in the book of Daniel to the beautiful land of Israel. Eliezer envisioned a Hebrew paper that would feature all topics of interest to a nation, including international and local topics, weather bulletins, and fashion. Ben Yehuda believed that if he published a newspaper at a low price, many people would subscribe and become convinced of their ability to express everything they could want to express in Hebrew. Ben Yehuda also used his paper as a means to introduce new words which hitherto were missing, such as newspaper, editor, telegram, subscriber, soldier, fashion, and many others. What with the Jewish people being such avid readers, Ben Yehuda's paper did much to spread his ideas and his linguistic coinages, both in Israel and in the diaspora. In 1891, 10 years after Eliezer and Devorah first set foot on the shores of Israel, Devorah died of tuberculosis. She left Eliezer with 5 small children. Then, shortly after the death of Devorah, 3 of those 5 children died of diphtheria, within 10 days of each other. The loss was almost more than Eliezer could bear. Devorah's deathbed wish was that Eliezer marry her younger sister Pola, who had had a crush on Eliezer when she was a little girl. Before Devorah died, she even sent a letter to her younger sister saying, "If you want to marry a prince, come to Jerusalem and marry my husband." 6 months later, Pola and Eliezer were married. Pola was a woman of great drive and conviction, and she made it her life's mission to support Eliezer and his campaign. She took the Hebrew name Chemda, quickly learned Hebrew, became a reporter for his paper, and later became its editor, giving her husband time to research the lost Hebrew words and coin the new Hebrew words that the reborn language was requiring. Eliezer wasn't popular with the religious Jewish community in Jerusalem. When he and Devorah first moved to Israel, he lived an observant lifestyle, attending synagogue, following traditional Jewish practice. However, within a short amount of time, the Orthodox community accused Eliezer of being insincere and treated him quite rudely. Eliezer reacted by discarding religious tradition and publicly attacking the religious community for misappropriation of funds. It was the start of a long and bitter war. Finally, in 1894, some of Ben Yehuda's enemies from the religious community deliberately mistranslated a line from an article in The Deer that read, "Let us gather strength and go forward," as meaning, "Let us gather an army and proceed against the east." They informed the Ottoman government that Ben Yehuda was calling on his followers to revolt. He was arrested, charged with conspiracy to revolt, and sentenced to a year's imprisonment. Jews throughout the world were outraged. Eventually, after much bribery and international intervention, Ben Yehuda's sentence was appealed and he was released. However, he was prohibited from publishing his newspaper for a full year. This year-long ban on publishing the newspaper actually turned out for the best. During this time, Ben Yehuda began working in earnest on his project of a modern Hebrew dictionary. Ben Yehuda's dictionary had actually started as a simple aid for himself when he was still in Paris. At first it contained only a short bilingual list in Hebrew and French written in the back of the notebook which he wrote down his grocery lists in. But, as Ben Yehuda himself explains in the introduction to his finished dictionary, when he began speaking Hebrew daily, he became more aware of the lack of words in Hebrew, and his list grew longer. He began publishing word lists in his newspaper as aids for other would-be speakers with similar problems. There were difficulties, of course. As long as Ben Yehuda spoke Hebrew at home or with his friends, he was able to use the language more or less as he wished. But if he wanted the entire society to use Hebrew, then the words would have to be precise and accurate according to strict philological rules. Therefore, Ben Yehuda became a scientific lexicographer. He often worked 18 hours a day on his dictionary. And finally, in 1910, Ben Yehuda published the first of what became a 17-volume set entitled Complete Dictionary of Ancient and Modern Hebrew. In December of 1890, Ben Yehuda founded the Va'ad Lashon, the Language Council, to aid him in the development of his dictionary and to resolve a plethora of questions connected with the development of modern Hebrew. Questions regarding Hebrew terminology, pronunciation, spelling, and punctuation. The council was the forerunner of today's Hebrew Language Academy, the authority in Israel on all matters pertaining to the Hebrew language. It's sometimes said that Eliezer ben Yehuda single-handedly revived the Hebrew language. This statement is partially true, but not entirely true. It is true that Ben Yehuda was the chief proponent of the Hebrew language revival. It's also true that he was the keynote scholar of the Hebrew Renaissance and one of the great father figures of the Zionist movement. But Ben Yehuda did rely heavily on the support of the emerging Zionist movement around him. From his teens, men such as Rabbi Joseph Blocher and Solomon Jonas played key roles in Ben Yehuda's development. In Paris and then in Jerusalem, people rallied to Eliezer's cause and offered their assistance in various capacities. Of course, one could never overstate the value of the personal support of Eliezer's beloved Devorah and her mutual commitment to raising the first Hebrew-speaking child. Nor could one overestimate the critical importance of Chemda's robust involvement on all fronts in the last several decades of Ben Yehuda's life. And, finally, in 1881, one couldn't mention the success of Ben Yehuda without mentioning those first waves of Jewish pioneers who made their way to Israel, with the first wave arriving in that year, 1881, the same year that the Ben Yehudas landed on Israel's shores. These early pioneers were of inestimable help to Ben Yehuda as they were receptive to his novel ideas and were ready to speak Hebrew as he insisted. These pioneers taught their children to speak Hebrew as their first language, both in the home and at the schools that they set up throughout the country. Thus, within a biblical generation, in the 40 years between 1881 and 1921, a core of young, fervent Hebrew language speakers was formed, with Hebrew as the unique symbol of their emerging national life, and Eliezer ben Yehuda as one of their strongest representatives. Towards the end of that 40-year period, Ben Yehuda was forced to temporarily leave Israel after the outbreak of World War I. Along with other Zionist leaders, he spent the war years in the United States, returning to Israel in 1919. And finally, on the banner day of November 29, 1922, under the guidance of Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner of Palestine, the British government made Hebrew one of the 3 official languages of the Palestine Mandate and the official language of the Jews in Israel. This monumental decision signaled the success of Ben Yehuda's quest to see Hebrew become the language of his emerging nation. Eliezer's dream of seeing the Jewish people reborn as a Hebrew-speaking nation in the land of Israel had come true. Only 1 month later, in December 1922, Eliezer ben Yehuda died at the age of 64 of the tuberculosis that he had battled since his Paris days. He was buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem in a funeral attended by 30,000 people. In 1908, Ben Yehuda had written in his newspaper, "For everything there is needed only one wise, clever, and active man, with the initiative to devote all his energies to it, and the matter will progress, all obstacles in the way notwithstanding. In every new event, every step, even the smallest in the path of progress, it is necessary that there be one pioneer who will lead the way without leaving any possibility of turning back. for the revival of the Hebrew language, that pioneer was undoubtedly Eliezer ben Yehuda. I wish I could tell you so much more about this remarkable man and his story. There are so many details that I've had to pass over. There are so many miraculous turns throughout his story, events that you could tell were supernaturally arranged. I have 2 books that I would recommend to you if you would like to learn more about the story of Eliezer ben Yehuda, and in the process, read more about the story of how the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel in the last century and a half and under. This book here is entitled Tongue of the Prophets. It's written by Robert St. John. It's a very easy reading book. It's the story of Eliezer in story form. Wonderful reading, not only for adults but for children. I highly recommend that book, Tongue of the Prophets by Robert St. John. A second book I would highly recommend is Fulfillment of Prophecy by Eliezer ben Yehuda. Now, this isn't the Eliezer ben Yehuda that authored this book, although there are excerpts from his autobiography in it. This book was written by one of his direct descendants who was named Eliezer ben Yehuda after him. So Fulfillment of Prophecy by Eliezer ben Yehuda is another excellent book. This book contains much personal information about Ben Yehuda. It's more detailed, and it'll also give you a very broad overview of Jewish history and world history as it pertained to Jewish history. So if you are looking to learn more about Eliezer ben Yehuda, I highly recommend those 2 books for your education and your reading enjoyment.